Welcome to GovCon Intelligence. My guest today is Stephanie Kostro. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Sam, for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Stephanie Kostro is the president of the Professional Services Council, the leading trade association and voice of the federal contracting industry. As president, Stephanie guides PSC strategic direction, advocacy, and member engagement efforts across growing federal industry priorities. She has more than 20 years of experience in the U.S. government and industry and brings a wealth of knowledge in federal procurement, policy and acquisition regulations, government processes and programs, and public-private partnerships. And boy, you have been busy lately. There's a lot happening. So what is the vibe among your members right now at PSC with this torrent of policy changes and FAR overhaul, small business action, just generally how they fared through the last year and year and a half?
It is a great question, Sam. We have not rested in the last 15 months, it's fair to say. Let me give a quick thumbnail sketch of who PSC is, if I could. We are, as you mentioned, a trade association. We represent more than 400 government services and solutions contractors. And by solutions, I mean technology, innovation, et cetera. So not manufacturers per se, but those who offer the other end of the spectrum of services and solutions. I would also note that of our 400 member companies, a full 65% qualify in some way, shape, or form as a small business. And so I would love to talk about specifically how the last 15 months have touched on and impacted small businesses in particular. I would note, so you put your thumb on a lot of the things that we're covering. A lot of the executive orders that have come out had, what's different about this president is a lot of the executive orders have touched on federal contracting, right? It's been an amazing, you said torrent, tidal wave of what's been coming over the transom for us. And I think, whether it's consolidation of procurement at the General Services Administration or some of the sea changes that we're seeing at the Department of Defense or War, there's a lot in the mix over the last 15 months.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because I saw the executive order directing the FAR Council to issue deviations. And I thought, wow, somebody at the White House knows what a deviation is. That's interesting. And then, you have the Secretary Hegseth talking about the 8A program and SBA. So it's gotten more attention in the highest levels of government than I've seen in previous administration.
That's absolutely true. And we do have someone who is heading up the White House Office of Federal Procurement Policy. For those of your listeners who dork out like I do on this stuff, it's OFPP, who has industry experience. And so I think that's a critical component of what we're seeing here, whether it's the move towards fixed price contracting or commercial solutions. I think that has a lot to play, that we have a lot of folks with experience in business now in the government.
And that's Dr. Kevin Rhodes.
That is Dr. Kevin Rhodes, yes.
Did you have them recently?
We did have them at our annual conference. So the Professional Services Council, we have a big event in West Virginia every year. And we had all of the FAR Council principals come on a panel and talk about what they're doing with the revolutionary FAR overhaul, what they're doing on contract consolidation, et cetera. Dr. Rhodes was one of our guest speakers alongside Jeff Kosis from the GSA, Marvin Horn of NASA, and John Tenaglia of the Department of War.
Oh, what a great get to get all those people in one room together.
Yeah, I've warned them that this is going to be an annual thing. It's an annual conference, and we should get them all in West Virginia every year.
They're going to do a FAR overhaul every year? Let's see what they have to say for next year. Well, we'll start at the top of government, not quite with President Trump, but we'll go to the next level with Vice President J.D. Vance, who has started up a fraud task force. And one of the first functions of that fraud task force, it appears, is to look at government contractors. And small businesses have been very familiar with this over the last year. We've been covering it a lot on GovCon Intelligence with audits in the 8A program. And then there was an audit by DOW, the sledgehammer audit. We tell from press reports that GSA has begun to send out direct inquiries to contractors they view as fraudulent. It's not really clear where they're finding fraud here, but they've at least started to send out these letters. And then, of course, SBA is continuing its 8A audit. The Inspector General at SBA is going to look closely at the women-owned and service-able veteran-owned programs as well. There were a lot of I've been working with many, many small businesses. All of them that I've worked with are above board. They're doing their best to be compliant, but they're very scared about getting caught up in this fraud investigation, audits, et cetera. How worried should small businesses like that 65% that you mentioned at PSC be worried about fraud task force and additional audits and investigations?
It's a great question, Sam, because PSC's mission as a trade association, like a lot of our brethren out in our space, we exist for three main reasons. One is to advocate on behalf of our members. One is to educate. And that in part, that is helping the broader American public know the value that contractors bring to the table. But it's also to let executive branch and legislative branch folks know how important this segment of industry is. And then also to facilitate that networking, that meeting of minds so that we can have a healthy discussion and candid back and forth with customers, between customers and industry. So how worried should small businesses be? We're asked by a lot of our member companies, what should they do? And it's a fair question. Just to back up a little bit, the task force reportedly is investigating $6.3 billion worth of contracting dollars that have gone out. I'm not sure where that number comes from, but that net captures a lot of companies, large and small. And so what are they looking for? And what are these hundreds of letters that have gone out between the task force and the General Services Administration? So just on the letters themselves, if you receive a letter, you have 30 days to respond. And we are encouraging any business that receives such a letter to be responsive, to be timely, meet that 30-day requirement. But also, even before you get a letter, and this goes back to the 8A investigation that was launched a year ago,
Right.
Or audit rather, that was launched a year ago, is the first thing that they should do is look at your own house, make sure everything inside your company is in order so that you can be responsive, that you have the documentation. What is the task force and what are these GSA letters looking for? It's looking for, are you a shell company or are you a legitimate small business? Shell company meaning you're putting forward something where you might we consider it false ownership or control. Are you misrepresenting yourself as a small business when actually you're not? What are the pass-through schemes? And I use that word scheme deliberately, Sam, because I think any reasonable government official would say, okay, we've awarded the contract and your work share when you're performing the work is different from what you proposed. That's life. That is reality. When I was growing up professionally at the Department of Defense, the plan is great until it has first contact with reality, right? And so you have to shift resources, staffing shifts, etc. But the scheme is important because are you habitually going out with a large company, bidding in a certain way, and at the end of the day, as a small business, you're claiming a fee and doing minimal work, while a large business is getting the lion's share. So they're looking for patterns like that. So if you do your due diligence inside your company first, you run your own internal reviews, you can mitigate your audit risk. The second thing, and I'll tell you ahead of time, Sam, I've got 5 suggestions that we give to small businesses. The internal review is first. The second is you should expect requests for evidence of eligibility. What does that mean? Do you have a physical location where you say you have a physical location? So you're not trying to get, for example, a hub zone award because you say you're located in a hub zone, but your headquarters isn't there. You don't have the number of employees you say we're there. So they're looking for evidence of eligibility. The third is to be prompt with your response. We went over that just briefly. The fourth piece of advice is if you have a joint venture or subcontracting arrangement that will receive scrutiny, please ensure that your compliance and documentation are in order. JVs in particular and sole source awards have come under additional scrutiny, certainly during the 8A program audit, but also in some of these other ways. And then finally, it's more prospective and less responsive. And that is, you should expect as a small business, strict eligibility reviews and research requirements coming down the pike to make sure that if it is a socioeconomic set aside, that it is going to someone who is legitimately eligible for that set aside.
It sounds like based on what you're saying then that small businesses are even more under the microscope than larges because they have these additional appliance requirements with joint venture, the limitation on subcontracting, you mentioned the hub zone program. Does it seem like it's putting more of a burden on smalls than it would be on those that aren't in those programs?
I'd say it's under a microscope in terms of they are getting looked at. We do have folks, and we can talk about this later or now if you'd like, who are on the Hill who are introducing legislation to remove some of these socioeconomic set-asides, whether it's women-owned small business, etc. And really, will that see the light of day? What is that going to do? There's a lot of conversation happening here. I think if you also look at what has happened to the federal workforce in the last 15 months, it has undergone a sea change as well. So OSJBUs, these offices of small and disadvantaged business utilization in a lot of the departments and agencies are much smaller than they used to be. And so that means the workload has increased on the few civil servants who are left in those offices. And so while I do think there might be heightened scrutiny, I'm not sure who's going to be conducting that scrutiny because there are fewer civil servants and, to be honest, political appointees in these jobs than there were 15 months ago.
The fear is, from the small business perspective, that the people who are conducting these investigations or audits won't have full understanding of the programs. Hub zone program you mentioned, very complex. Limitation on subcontracts, joint ventures, also very complex. You saw some of that with the ATI videos where people came out afterwards that actually you can do that. You can do some of these things that they're talking about as being pass-through schemes.
Yep.
So that's a really good point, that with OSDBUs on the decline in numbers, that there may just not be the people with the substantive knowledge to understand what the actual rules are and whether you're right on the line of compliance or you're over that into non-compliance.
I think that's true. I think also when you look at the scrutiny that is coming, again, from what was DOGE last year, that Department of Government Efficiency, and a lot of the civil servants across the board, not just in acquisition roles or contracting officer roles, but across the entire civil service, either took voluntary early retirement or they did that deferred resignation program that we heard so much about this time last year. And they riffed people. There were reductions in force as well. So with all of that happening, the civil service across the board is smaller than it had been, but they did actually hire some people back, and they do have some new people at the table. Those people aren't generally not getting hired into OSDBUs, those addresses of small and disadvantaged business utilization. But I would say I do think the numbers aren't where they need to be in these offices. And I do think as a result, you've got folks who are not particularly well trained yet, who might be new to the role. I would also note, and I can't cite the specific department because this was in a meeting under the Chatham House rule. And if I say it, you guys would know. But I would say, when I sat next to a senior procurement executive from a sizable department, she was telling me that as of September 30th of 2025, she had 600 contracting officers. At the beginning of the year, in January of 2025, she had 1,800. So she had a third of the workforce in 1102 billets, those contracting officer billets, than she did at the beginning of the year. And if you're a contracting officer and you're looking to the seat to the left of you and to the seat to the right of you, and they're both empty, I'm not sure you're going to sign up for a training course to understand better the hub zone requirements, right?
Right.
And so
there's times as much work anyway.
Exactly. And you're probably, having part applications while you're sitting there going, what am I doing? I've not managed this particular program before. I don't know, what is going on in this space. So let me just sort of copy and paste what my predecessor in this role had done. And so I think there's a bit of a learning curve for the new folks coming in. But again, I don't think they're coming into OSDB rules. And so when we talk about small businesses being under a microscope, I do worry that the person looking through the lens isn't sure what they're looking for.
Yeah. It sounds like your focus, either on your own, Stephanie, or PSC, is very much on the workforce, on the procurement workforce. Whether the OSDBUs or contracting officers, we're certainly seeing declining numbers in the 1102 ranks, and anybody that the small businesses work with. And you're actually seeing that play itself out in bid protests of decisions that are coming out, where it seems like the government is skipping steps, potentially because of having fewer people around. How does that play into the work that PSC is doing on the Hill or advocacy within the agencies?
So we have 5 priorities at PSC, and one of them is to highlight the value of the federal contractor. The second is to make the government a smarter customer and a better buyer. A smarter customer is knowing what is out there as a capability. Better buyer is the way you can access it. The third is access to tech and innovation. And the fourth is actually federal workforces. And when we talk about federal workforces as a priority area, it is not just contractor workforces when we focus on things like suitability requirements, security clearances, pipelines, recruitment pipelines from colleges and universities, or if you're in the manufacturing world, like presumably vocational schools, as well as training programs, apprenticeships, etc. But we also talk about contracting officers, contracting officer representatives, program managers, the entire suite of the acquisition professional profession. And so when we go to the Hill, that is certainly one of the 4 prongs that we highlight. And we are working closely with folks at my old shop. I used to be on the House Armed Services Committee staff as the policy director. So we are working with the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. They have a must-pass bill every year, the National Defense Authorization Act. And last year for FY26, there were a lot of provisions that were very helpful for acquisition and transformation. And so we saw a lot of that also come out. You mentioned Secretary Hegseth talking about acquisition transformation, talking about the 8A program, talking about program acquisition executives versus program executive offices. And for those who don't know the defense world, they sound the same, but they're very, very different about portfolio management as opposed to just a specific program office. And as we move forward with folks on the Hill, we are very interested in talking about acquisition, workforce reform, as well as within the context of that larger transformation.
What was PSC's view on how Hegseth was transforming the acquisition and workforce organization? You talk about the revolutionary FAR overhaul. People will argue whether that's revolutionary or not revolutionary.
Yeah, that argument.
This is revolutionary. I feel like this legitimately is revolutionary.
So PSC was one of the associations that attended alongside 300 industry CEOs the Arsenal of Freedom speech that Secretary Hegseth gave back last November. And it was, I want to say, 75 minutes of Secretary Hegseth speaking about acquisition. I'd never thought that a Secretary of Defense or War would do something like that, but he was very conversant in what he was talking about. And it was about acquisition transformation. It was about reorganizing how they conduct the work that they're doing, but also to emphasize commercial solutions. And we've seen that in some executive orders and some of the White House statements as well about access to commercial products and services through fixed price contracts or what have you. I was very interested in hearing about how they were structuring things at the Pentagon in terms of not just acquisition tools that they were using, whether it's other transaction agreements or commercial solutions openings, but also how he was emphasizing having commercial components to an acquisition. So you may have something that is very bespoke, military capabilities that are being acquired, but they can have commercial components to it. And he was emphasizing that. The second kind of leg to that stool, in addition to how things got acquired faster or cheaper, et cetera, was the requirements process. And I think that's often a too hard to resolve problem. And so people kind of push it to the side. But the requirements process at the Pentagon and elsewhere is so lengthy, particularly in fast evolving situations like emerging technologies. So whether it's quantum or artificial intelligence, et cetera, the requirements process, if it's 2 years, is way too slow. And so I am thrilled to see that the Pentagon is relooking and transforming that piece. And then the third leg of that stool was the foreign sales piece, which is how do we get capabilities and capacities into the hands of our friends and allies and partners quicker. And so with those three legs of the stool, I really do think the Pentagon has a once in a generation opportunity to make real change. And we are seeing activities. The one caveat I would add, Sam, is that at last I heard they had 38 working groups at Pentagon looking at this. It's too many working groups, right? It's sort of it's too much of a bureaucracy to move quickly. And so I understand why they have the 38 working groups. I hope a lot of them are reaching out to industry to see what is in the art of the possible. And I'm hoping that it can get rolled up in a very sort of efficient way. But once I heard that number, I that first little niggle of doubt, that little tiny like, oh my gosh, what are they doing, came to my brain.
Can't be the federal government without working groups and committees. How do you give people something to do?
It's always amazing to me, though, because, once you create something, it's really hard to disband it. So I always try to err on the side of streamlining things and having 5 working groups, 6 working groups, 38 right out the gate seemed like a lot. I want to be wrong on this, and I hope that I am, and I hope that they roll things out very, very efficiently and quickly.
Well, you mentioned
my experience, but I hope that they do.
Yes, and it sounded like during that speech, this stuff was supposed to happen tomorrow, and so having 38 working groups is going to prevent it from happening in the near future. You mentioned the NDAA and some of the Cs of NDAA 26 were commercial buying, the reorganization of the workforce. What about the next round? What this must pass? What is PSC looking at there? What is industry interested in seeing at NDAA 2027?
Yeah, that's a great question, particularly since we're having this conversation now. My understanding is that the Armed Services Committees have their chairman markups coming up in a couple of weeks here in early June. And so amendments are due in late May, at least for the House side. And as we move forward, I'm very interested to see what the personal offices have to say as part of that committee markup process. Last year, the FY26 NDAA was very groundbreaking in this acquisition reform, as we just talked about. a couple of things are noteworthy. One is their treatment of non-traditional contractors. Now, that's a phrase that has been used repeatedly over the last decade or so. And there are some non-traditional contractors who have been non-traditional for 20 years now. So, it's kind of funny to say, all right, given the definition of what non-traditional is, at one point did they cross the Rubicon and become traditional. That said, what we're hoping to avoid in the 27 markup period and also in conference is anything that hints at a set aside for non-traditionals. And what do I mean by that? We are very supportive at PSC of socioeconomic set asides. We have, as I mentioned, a lot of small businesses as part of PSC, women-owned, veteran-owned, et cetera. There was a movement afoot in the FY26 NDAA process to have a set of work that was set aside for non-traditionals. And I don't know that that is a healthy way to think about how to leverage the capabilities of non-traditionals. Now, what I appreciate about what they did last year is that they made things easier from a cost and accounting standards, the CAS standard requirements for non-traditionals. I would like to see in the 27 bill, if we want to go to GAAP, so the generally accepted accounting principles across the board for all contractors, I think that would be great, not just non-traditional. So I think if we're going to make things easier for one segment of the industrial population, I think we should do it for everybody. And so that's what we're looking to work with HASC, SAS, and PAC, the appropriations committees as well. I would also note one area that we talked about last year, we're going to continue to talk about this year for the FY27 bill, is intellectual property and tech data rights. So we have licensing agreements that oftentimes will allow the department or the customer to have access to technical data and to intellectual property, particularly important when the government has contributed the costs to develop that IP, right? So the government has some ownership stake there. But I also want to make sure that we are protecting intellectual property flight. So it's a matter of how are we going to protect that information if the government does have access to it. And then finally, one of the areas that we want to work with HASC, SASC, and others this year will be on that workforce issue that you and I talked about, to make sure that if there are training modules going forward, that industry can contribute to them or can actually receive the training itself. So what I found really helpful from my conversations with the FAR Council principals about the FAR Overhaul is that they are developing training for the new, whether they're class deviations or we'll see the proposed rules at some point soon, hopefully, but they're going to have to train the acquisition workforce on that. I've understood them to be developing training modules that will be accessible by both government officials and industry officials, so everyone's hearing the same thing. I think that should be more of the rule than the exception going forward. And I think to the extent, if you're going to explain industry to government officials taking these training courses, industry should probably be, I'm happy as a trade association to help develop those materials so it's an accurate representation of what industry is interested in.
Yeah, you often hear from industry, from small business especially, that they have to sometimes educate their contracting officers themselves on what the authorities are or how far they can go. So what should small businesses be looking for in this FY27 round of NDAA negotiations?
Yeah, so, because it's a must-pass bill, the NDAA is often turned either a Christmas tree that ornaments get hung on or a tractor that's pulling other things across the field, right? And so I think as we look at the FY27 NDAA, I think taking a look at what is going on with the rule of two, if any of that language creeps into the NDAA, to make sure that there's a statutory basis for the rule of two and when it's applied, whether it's at the contract level or at the task order level, looking into that. I think we should also look at whether or not some of the authorities that were granted for the Department of Defense last year or Department of War last year get extended to civilian agencies. And I think small businesses should keep an eye on that to make sure that, hey, if things are going to get easier, whether it's cost and accounting standards, et cetera, for defense companies, is that going to apply to companies that support civilian agencies? I think that's something that we need to keep an eye on. We almost got there last year with applying some of those reforms to civilian agencies, but there was an outside jurisdiction issue,
right,
and the committees of jurisdiction decided not to let those move forward. I think that's fair. We need to have these conversations, and I hope we have them in the next 6 months.
But it's very good for particularly these non-traditional companies that are coming from the outside, to have consistency if they're, say, working with Homeland as well as with War, that they can predict what, say, the IP rights are going to be or what the standards are from accounting.
So that's a really good point, Sam, as are all of your points. But I would say that, when we look at companies and what they've gone through over the last 15 months, because of DOGE and a lot of the rescopings, descopings, contract terminations, it has really forced a lot of government contractors to think differently about their customer base within the government. And so some who were just solely defense contractors are now also Homeland Security contractors, or maybe if they worked for the Defense Health Agency, they're now looking more at HHS and other health agencies. And so, if we are making it easier for defense contractors, we should also be making it easier for folks who are sometimes defense contractors or would like to be defense contractors, right? And this goes back also to things like the Cyber Maturity Model Certification Program, or CMMC at Defense, where you have a certain cyber standard here, but not for the rest of the industry that works with civilian agencies. And so you create that dichotomy as you're a defense contractor, you have this set of rules. If you're a civilian agency contractor, you have this other set of rules. I think that creates inefficiencies. And if we could have similar common sense rules across the board, that would be helpful. And that's the kind of thing that when we have conversations about the NDAA, because it is legislation that gets signed into law every year, it's a really great opportunity to level that playing field and make it easier for companies to do business with the government.
That's true. It's the one way that you can promote consistency at the FAR, that everybody has to follow the same law and follow the same regulations. Switching gears now to GSA's OneGov initiative. GSA came out this week stating that it had saved $1.1 billion through the OneGov initiative. They also said earlier this week that they have reached a deal with Snowflake. And I was a Snowflake user when I was at SVA, and we had a value-added reseller that sold a Snowflake. They're actually located down the hall. I wonder if they're hearing this. I don't know if they're going to continue doing that, or if they still use Snowflake, if they're going to go straight to the OEM. In addition to OneGov, GSA last year sent out these data calls about reseller markups too. And I imagine PSC was very involved hearing from the companies that received those markup letters. So value-added resellers have been concerned about OneGov. They've been advocating for their role in the marketplace. What is that role now in a OneGov world for value-added resellers?
So just to review for your listeners what OneGov is, right? It was announced just over a year ago as a way for the government to leverage its enterprise-wide power, really, to work with, I hesitate to say monopsonistic, because it's a lot of times it's commercial goods and services. So they're not a monopsony or the only user of these things, right? But they do have enterprise-wide sway over how they work with and gain access to capabilities. And so IT is the first sector out of the gate for OneGov, but it's not going to be limited to IT going forward. My understanding is they are going to look at how to leverage the federal government's enterprise-wide power over things like hardware, platforms, infrastructure, cybersecurity, et cetera. But then on the IT front, the goals of OneGov were to negotiate directly with the original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, 70 to 90% discounts on software. I mean, that's huge, right? A 90% discount from Google or Microsoft, et cetera, is enormous. And so that was one of the focuses. The others were to access pre-negotiated agreements through value-added resellers on the multiple award schedules. So that, I think, speaks to exactly what you're asking about. So what are the value-added resellers? How are they positioning themselves given the additional scrutiny that they're coming under? There was a rumor out there that they wanted to limit the markup for value-added resellers to a certain very low percentage.
Right.
And I think that reflected an unclear understanding of what it is. What is the value that value-added resellers bring to the table? And so we did talk to folks about that request for information to respond to the government about what it is that value-added resellers bring to the table. A couple of things that they do, and this is how we advise companies to talk about themselves, right? They help with procurement efficiencies. They accelerate tech acquisition by using pre-existing contract vehicles like the schedules and like NASA SOUP, et cetera, so that you can bypass lengthy open market bidding. You have regulatory compliance support when you use a value-added reseller. They can do systems integration and customization. And I mentioned that one specifically because there was a memo coming out of the Pentagon last year, just over a year ago, that talked about the need to move systems integration into the civil service as a core competency. I don't think they've gotten super far on that. I do think there is a real business case to be made to actually outsource systems integration to companies. And so value-added resellers are part of that ecosystem that can offer the systems integration and the customization piece.
You would need really high technical expertise to be able to do that within government because the components of the system are changing all the time.
You do need to stay up to date. Not only that, but you have to have that agility to be able to go out to the marketplace and test things out, right? And bring the best solutions back to the job that you're doing. And I'm not sure currently that the government is structured to have that level of agility and flexibility within the civil service to go ahead and do that. I'm not saying they couldn't get there. I'm just saying, I do think there's a business case to be made for outsourcing that. So value-added resellers can do that. They can also do some risk management and cybersecurity elements, and they do lifecycle support. So when we were talking to the government about what is the value that value-added resellers bring and why do they deserve more than a couple of percentage points of a markup, it's because they bring these additional capabilities to the table, and it shifts some of the risk to the company. I mentioned a few times now this fixed price executive order, and I think your listeners probably know when you have a fixed price contract, a lot of risk gets shifted to the contractor because they're tied to that price that they've negotiated. They don't get reimbursed for additional costs that they might incur due to inflation or supply chain disruptions, et cetera. And so I like to couch this VAR, value-added reseller, conversation in a risk basis because you're outsourcing some of the risk there.
That makes sense that now the contractor has to take all the risk. That's the preference for fixed price. That's why the executive order came out a couple of weeks ago. One of the arguments against OneGov that I've heard, and I think it might have come up on this show, is in negotiating the steep discounts, there could be lock-in for the government that you're basically having this OEM buy in early, but then the government's then dependent on that OEM once they're in all the systems. Do you have that fear at PSC? Is this billion going to continue to build on itself, or could you actually get some of that clawed back on the back end with lock-in?
I do wonder if you could get some clawed back. I wonder also the terms of these agreements, how long are they, and when do they have, a little bit of flexibility to terminate and then renegotiate. So, from my understanding of some of these agreements, what I've been told that they might have offered 70 to 90% discount in year one, but not in the out years. And so the other question becomes, what is the long-term cost savings? And is it actually, do you smooth out that discount as a company over the course of the entire agreement? I would, if I were the company, I would try to do that, but I'm not sure what's going on with the deal teams that are creating these on the government side.
Yeah, well, $1.1 billion is a big splash in just a year. It's a big amount of money. You mentioned the FAR Council, having them at the Greenbrier Conference. And so you may be more in tune with the FAR Overhaul process than others, just hearing freshly from the FAR Council principals. We're in the state right now where class deviations are out. They've been adopted by pretty much every agency, but we're still waiting on the proposed rules to come out. At some point, there was a lot of talk that would come out in April. We're now toward the end of May. So probably looking June, maybe even later. They're on the OIRA list right now. There's speculation that the proposed rules might be different from the class deviations, what was essentially on the website. What do you expect to see from the proposed rules?
So I'm going to be honest with you, Sam. I'd hope the proposed rules are different from the class deviations. And it's not because the class deviations are bad in a way, shape, or form. It's the fact that there were comments submitted from industry and the broader public on those class deviations. And I understand that the FAR Council and others, they're incorporating some of that feedback. And so I do hope that the proposed rules are not exactly the same as the class deviations. But that does create an issue, right? Because you've got some legacy clauses, old FAR clauses in existing contracts. You've got these class deviations in the existing contracts. And you're going to have new clauses incorporated into contracts. This is what some of the government folks have been calling the messy middle. How do you deal with legacy class deviations and new FAR clauses going forward? And it is going to be messy. It's going to cost a lot to change some of these. On the contractor side, you're going to have a lot of attorney costs, general counsel, etc., outside counsel cost to help you understand to accept these new clauses into your contracts and then to comply both with legacy and new clauses. And so there was a joke that, the ones who are really benefiting from this FAR overhaul are the attorneys. I would say all of us are benefiting at the end, but we would really like to see these proposed rules come out. Just like you, I heard they were coming out. I was told it wasn't going to be a holiday present, that it was going to come out in January, and then it was going to come out in February, and now we're marching towards the middle of the year. But I have confidence that, they'll clear OIRA, and then we'll start to see them. And some, of course, will impact small businesses more than others. And so I'm looking forward to seeing those.
Look, in defense of the FAR drafting teams, because I was on a FAR drafting team, these things take time to write. And especially if you have industry comments that address particular areas, these FAR drafting teams have people from many agencies, definitely the FAR council agencies, but SBA is involved, a lot of civilian agencies are involved. So you have different views on that, and you have to figure out where you're going to come out and have people that dissent from the majority view on how it comes out. So it takes a while to go through, especially when you have comments and get the language right.
Well, the adjudication process is always lengthy. And so I have a lot of sympathy. Having been a government, civil servant myself, I understand, how long these processes take. This is not an indictment of how long it's taking. It's just, I'm very eager to see what they are. And so I think, if the product at the end of the day is better than it was because of this process, and I think it will be, take all the time you need. But I do think, you talked about whether or not this is actually a revolutionary initiative. I do think it is, but I also think a lot has been pushed into the companion guides, etc. The again, ecosystem that crops up around this FAR overhaul. Would also say, we mentioned earlier that sometimes, you've got defense contractors who are now also Homeland Security space or VA or HHS, etc. And they all have their own supplements. One of the issues that we've highlighted several times with the FAR Council, and they're aware of it, it's going to be hard to deal with this piece, which is you've got the FAR proposed rules coming out, and then you've also got changes underwriting each of the agency supplements. And each agency has its own team looking at the base FAR language and then coming up with its own supplement language. And they may interpret something differently than their colleagues down the street in a different agency might. But if you are a contractor and now you have a DFARS clause because you're a defense contractor, and you also have, the FAR supplement for HHS because you're an HHS contractor, and they're just slightly different, this is a compliance part. Sure, like the messy middle, right? So it's not just about the FAR overall, it's about all of the supplements as well. And so the first thing out of the gate needs to be these proposed rules for the FAR itself. And then hopefully we can have a conversation about aligning all the supplements.
What about from the small business point of view? What sections of the FAR, potential changes should they be paying attention to?
Yeah, so it won't come as a surprise to have the FAR Part 19, right? So obviously any changes in that. But aside from the normal sort of things to watch about Rule of Two and how multiple award contracts are being treated at the contract level and then the task order level, but one of the FAR parts that we're tracking very, very closely is actually FAR Part 10. It was one of the first, the class deviations that came out was let's take a look at the market research piece, because that is critical to determining whether or not Rule of Two applies. Right. So the market research phase is going to be critical. And I think documentation to make sure that, and transparency of what efforts did the government undertake for market research in order to make a determination about which kind of acquisition approach you're going to take. I think that is going to be critical. But also say FAR Part 12, which is commercial. We're going to take a look at the simplified commercial buys, streamlined procurement procedures. And we do look at Part 33, which is the protest, right? Suspension, debarment, all of that as a result of some protest action. So those are the ones that we're watching out. From a small business perspective, they have very, very specific concerns in our community about the market research, about commercial, and about protest. And so those are the ones that we're watching.
Market research was a big one. It's like they took every mention of small business out of Part 10. It seemed like it was not a find and replace, but a find and delete. Maybe we've got enough comments to put one or two of them back in. Let's go back to that executive order on fixed price contracts. One thing that made a splash when it came out is this requirement that the agencies go back and look at their top 10 non-fixed price contracts within 90 days to review them and potentially modify them into fixed price. And even going forward, agencies have to award fixed price unless there's a justification. What do small businesses do now in this new fixed price regime? How does this impact them, and what sort of adjustments can they make?
Sure. Well, let's unpack first the top 10 requirement here. So the executive order, which for those of you following at home, I had the number here somewhere, but now I don't have it. The executive order that came out did ask all of the agencies, as defined presumably in Title 10 of U.S. Code as an agency, to come and look at their top 10 by contract value, non-fixed price contracts. And they have to, as you said, modify or restructure them. So when I was talking to small businesses about it, I said, listen, for the top 10, chances are it's not going to be a small business contract, right? However, you might be a sub or have some other relationship that is impacted by that contract review. So watch it very, very carefully. It's also how do you define an agency, or how are the agencies going to implement guidance that presumably is coming out from OMB here. I believe the guidance is coming out on June 14th, if I have my math correct, 45 days after the EO was signed. And so is it going to be the top 10 contracts from each of the military services or the defense agencies or the optives over at HHS or the components at DHS? And is it going to really be more than the top 10 at the department or agency level? Is it going to be the top 10 for everybody? And so let's take a look at that. And that, therefore, the small businesses might be more impacted with that approach than the previously mentioned one. In addition, what I found interesting is that this is again, you talked about the potentially overworked contracting officer workforce to have to provide written justification for every non-fixed price contract. Now, fixed price, according to FAR Part 16, you could be one of 5 or 6 different kinds of fixed price. It's not just firm fixed price. It could be fixed ceiling. It could be fixed price with equitable price adjustments, etc. So as we go forward, in talking to the FAR Council principals, they said, hey, they could have hybrid contracts, but there should be a fixed price element somewhere. If it's not the master contract, then maybe some large portion of it needs to be fixed price. But that written justification requirement is going to be a burden on that contracting officer. And if it goes above certain thresholds, not only does the contracting officer have to provide written justification to the agency head has to approve it.
Right.
So those thresholds, for the good of your audience, are $100 billion at the Department of Defense or War, $35 million at NASA, $25 at DHS, and $10 million for any other agency. And so agency head or whoever they designate, it has to be a political appointee. The EO is clear on that, has to approve it above those thresholds. That is also going to have a chilling effect on anything other than fixed price contracts, right?
Oh,
So
take weeks.
it's going to be huge. And I think as we move forward, and they now have to report on their progress on all of this, et cetera, the reporting requirements are due. The one is due if it's 90 days after the EO, that's July 29th, if my math is correct. Please don't check me, but it should be July 29th. So moving forward, I think it's going to be interesting. I would note, however, there is something in the FAR already that expresses a preference for firm fixed price or fixed price. And so this is not a new movement to move more towards fixed price, but it's that risk conversation that we need to have. If you're going to have fixed price contract with a contractor, you're asking them to accept more of the risk, whether it's inflation risk or, again, supply chain disruptions, the other one I mentioned. So the cost might actually go up. And then government should understand that fixed price contracts are not necessarily the cheapest kind of contract you can have. So it is shifting the risk, but it comes at a cost. And so that's a conversation I think we need to have more candidly going forward and more openly, to be honest, with transparency. Yes, a lot of industry is happy to do fixed price contracts. They've been around since the time immemorial. That's fine. They're used to it, but it's not necessarily going to be the cheapest.
The concern for an individual small business might be, though, that some of that gets washed away in competition. So, you see some of these small business competitions, there are hundreds of companies that come in and they're going to have different risk tolerance levels. And so it'll end up being the company that's most willing to take on the risk that wins rather than the company that might be the best value.
Yeah, one of the additional conversations is, if you have a contract with the government, say it's a long-term contract, what is the likelihood that you're going to have a clearly defined statement of objectives or requirements on day one of that contract that is not going to change over the life of a 5 or 10 year contract? So a lot of the costs come into play when it is a a change order. And so how is this going to be addressed? And I think also that comes into how willing are contractors to, work on the fly, take that risk initially, knowing that they're going to have a whole bunch of change orders that the government's going to pay for it later anyway. So that's part of that calculation as well.
One other item that's on my mind is the rising cost of everything. And I'm headed to California this summer to drive from Yosemite to LA, where gas might be $7 a gallon. No one up there. So small businesses are going to take some risk there as well as they enter into a long-term contract. Is there anything they can do in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I'm encouraging folks to think through, look at FAR Part 16 as currently formulated and as it comes out in the new and the FAR Overhaul as well, and take a look at it. Do not conflate this. Do not call this executive order the firm fixed price executive order. It's not. It's a fixed price executive order. So avail yourself and talk to your contracting officer, talk to whoever who's putting out the solicitation about EPA clauses.
EK.
Equitable price adjustments, right? So there are certain departments and agencies that are really used to having EPAs. And I'll give you an example. The Navy is in shipbuilding is very, very used to having EPA clauses as part of their contracts because it is a long-term. The window for building an aircraft carrier or even a destroyer or a frigate is years and years long. And so they have built in EPA clauses to adjust for inflation, for example. I'm encouraging people to have conversations with their customer about, could this be a fixed price with EPA built in so that you can address things like the rising price of fuel. Fuel is a huge issue. And again, I come from a Pentagon background. There are entire budget displays devoted to petroleum, oil, and lubricants, right? It's just dealing with the price fluctuations in those markets over the Defense Department is over the next 5 years or longer. But, you have to plan for these things. Smaller agencies don't have a FIDUP, the Future Years Defense Program, but it's just 5 years out. And so they may not realize that if we have 2% inflation now, but if it goes up to 7%, like it was a couple of years ago, you're going to need an EPA clause in that contract. And that's allowable under FAR Part 16.
Yeah, some other areas where that might be useful. You can't find a Mac Mini right now because of rising memory prices. You have the processors. I think the challenge from the agency point of view is how they obligate the funds for civilian agencies. Can they find the funds to obligate on EPA, or how do they calculate it?
How do they calculate it? Yeah. And how do they build it in? And I think also it's going to really impact these multi-year contracts. And so if it is a short-term 1-year contract, I think it's less of a risk, right, of inflation going haywire in a short term. But over the longer term, you're not entirely sure what it's going to do. Typically, historically, we've been at it between a 2% and a 3% rate of inflation. But again, last year or a few years ago, it hit people like a load of bricks to realize it was at 6 to 7%. And at that time, GSA started asking, hey, can we start talking about EPA clauses and allowing companies to come and request equitable adjustments there? And so as we have this conversation about fixed price, not firm fixed price, but fixed price contracts, let's have a conversation about some of the flexibilities that you can incorporate it into those contracts.
So not firm fixed price, it could potentially lead to fixed price with EPA. Both price adjustments
as an option.
So we're talking today on the same week that the House Small Business Committee held a markup. On May 28th, the House Small Business Committee unanimously passed H.R. 2804, which is the Protecting Small Business Competitions Act. You mentioned this, that it codifies the rule of two, but the markup added a major amendment exempting task and delivery orders. What is your view on the rule of two, on the application of orders, and how does this impact small businesses that are looking at big multi-agency vehicles or even an IDIQ contract?
Yeah, we talked earlier about the revolutionary FAR overhaul and the rule of two a little bit. The rule of two does matter because it is widely viewed as essential to maintaining a competitive marketplace that allows for innovation, particularly among small businesses, and to preserve a meaningful ecosystem of set-asides. I would also note, though, that the FAR overhaul took a similar approach, right, of allowing rule of two certification at the contract level, so you then didn't have to certify your small business eligibility for each task order, which actually is a common sense thing. If you're there on the master vehicle, why would you have to redo it for every task order? I think my sense is that that amendment took the same approach of, if you can do it here, why would you have to do it on the task order level? I do think this is opening folks up for protests, and we will see how that is actualized. Of course, now this bill has to have a companion in the Senate and see what happens there, or it can be folded into the NDAA. As I mentioned, that's something that we're watching very, very closely.
Yeah, so it really puts the rule of two in the same place that it is for the FAR overhaul, potentially making it easier to put into an end as you're going down the line.
Yeah, I think we need to look at it. What I appreciate very much about the Small Business Committee on either side of the hill is that they really do care about the community. And I think as we see some changes, whether it was the 8A program audit or women-owned small business or any of the others, that we are looking at a community that really cares about small businesses. The idea of putting it into statute is not a bad one, considering that the FAR overhaul is really trying to strip the FAR down to what is statutorily required. And so I think having these conversations is helpful. I'm really glad that they had that markup, and I'm really glad to see or to hear how much they still care about the community. I would say, we had Small Business Week not that long ago. It was in May. And I would like to see more statements of clear administration policy on how they would like the treatment of small businesses to proceed going forward. I don't think it hurts. It could help. I would also like to see dollars flowing to small businesses, not just rhetoric, but actual contracts going.
Yes. I mean, GSA has been very good about putting out the pools, and Oasis Plus seems to be heating up. Polaris has been started. So small businesses are getting work through those vehicles now. But you're right that during Small Business Week, we did not hear very much about contracting. And it'd be nice to get more of an emphasis on small business contractors from the White House. What else on Capitol Hill might small businesses want to track besides the rule of two? Anything else from this markup or anything else that you're looking at, maybe for NDAA?
Yeah, so for NDAA, it's the whole host of the issues. I would also say PSC, every year for 6 years straight, we put out a scorecard for federal market forecast. So we would look at the web-based procurement forecast for all of these agencies, departments and agencies. And then we would say whether or not they were easily accessible, whether it was clear about who to contact for certain solicitations, et cetera. We didn't have our scorecard last year in 2025. So a lot of the websites were paused or taken down because of DOGE and a lot of changes under them. We are now taking a fresh look at what those scorecards will look like, what the web-based forecast will look like. A lot of times those were required to be conducted or put together out of the OSDBUs. And so again, with shrinking OSDBUs, not sure who might have the rose pinned to their lapel to put out these web-based forecasts going forward, but hopefully someone will, if not the OSDBUs. Going forward, we want to work very closely with the White House, again, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, about what those forecasts look like, what are the small business opportunities, what requirements are coming down the pike for joint ventures or other sort of mentor-protege joint venture relationships. And I think as we move forward, it'll be critical to see, what does the next generation of federal contracting look like, given all of the change that we've seen in the last 15 months and that we're continuing to see, and how will it shape up? I do know the White House is very interested in attracting more new entrants to the federal marketplace. One way to do that is to have a reliable, accurate, and accessible web-based forecast. So companies are thinking about doing work with the government now that that tidal wave of changes has abated a little bit, is to have that web-based forecast so they can play around and see what they might qualify for and what they might want to do. So again, working with OFPP to talk about how to increase that pool of the defense, or not the defense base, but the industrial base that can support federal missions, I think is critical. We're part of the conversation across the board, and I think those conversations are going to continue well into the future.
Well, I love scorecards. I'm going to venture a prediction that your next forecast scorecard will have a different winner than your last forecast scorecard. But we'll see what happens.
I would say years ago, USAID was the winner. And so considering that agency has been largely dismantled, you're absolutely right for connecting up different folks going forward. But I would also say we're changing our approach. Our next forecast will come out in 2027, but we're announcing that approach next month at our Federal Acquisition Conference, which will be June 25th. And I'm excited to get this ball rolling again, because I think, again, as part of the federal ecosystem, we've got military personnel, we've got civil servants, and we have the federal contractor. And it is critical that all three of those function together.
All right, next conference right around the corner. Stephanie, how do people find you? How do they learn more about PSC?
Thanks for asking. So we are at pscouncil.org. pscouncil.org. We are also located in Arlington, so we're local. We have conferences. Please check out our website, pscouncil.org. Or if you are interested in membership at pscouncil.org will take you directly to our VP, Matt Busby, who is in charge of membership, and anyone on his team. You can also reach me personally as well as the policy team at policy@pscouncil.org.
Stephanie Kostro, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, everybody.